I'm going to keep this as focused as possible because there are a lot of details and I don't want it to sound like I'm reaching for anything dramatic. I'm not someone who believes in paranormal explanations, and I've always been pretty grounded when it comes to strange situations. But after everything that's happened over the last several years, I'm starting to think that explanation doesn't really matter. Something has been happening around me for a long time, and the only reason I didn't notice it sooner is because each individual incident was easy to dismiss on its own. I'm 25 now, and I live alone in a small apartment just outside a mid-sized city. I work a pretty normal office job, nothing exciting, and my routine hasn't changed much since college. I go to work, come home, make dinner, and usually spend my evenings doing something mindless to unwind. I'm mentioning that because there's nothing unusual about my lifestyle that would make me stand out or attract attention, at least not that I can think of. The first thing I remember happened when I was still living at home during my last year of high school. My parents' house was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where nothing ever really happened. No foot traffic at night, no parties, no noise. Everyone knew everyone else, and if a car you didn't recognize drove down the street, you noticed it. One night, I was up late, working on a paper in my room. My desk sat right under my window, which faced the street. Around midnight, I noticed headlights moving unusually slowly past the house. At first, I didn't think much of it. People drive slowly looking for addresses all the time. But the car didn't stop. It kept rolling forward at what felt like walking speed, eventually disappearing out of view. A few minutes later, the headlights came back. Same car, same speed, same path. This time, it stopped directly in front of our house. I remember waiting for a door to open or someone to get out, but nothing happened. The car just sat there, with the engine running. I watched for maybe 30 seconds before convincing myself it was nothing and going back to my work. By the time I looked again, the car was gone. I didn't mention it to anyone the next morning because it felt too insignificant. I honestly forgot about it within a few days. Looking back, that's probably the most unsettling part, how easily I dismissed it. Nothing else happened for years after that. I went off to college, moved back home briefly after graduating, and then got my own place. If you had asked me at that point whether I thought someone was watching me, I would have laughed. Then something else happened. By that time, I was 22 and living in a different apartment, closer to the city. The building wasn't large, just a handful of units, and my bedroom window overlooked a small parking lot and a side street. I worked early mornings back then, so I was usually asleep by midnight. One night, I woke up for no clear reason and noticed a faint light moving across my bedroom wall. At first, I thought it was a passing car, but the movement was wrong, slower, more deliberate. When I sat up and looked toward the window, the light disappeared. I waited for it to come back, heart beating faster than I expected it to. After maybe 10 seconds, it did. A narrow beam of light swept across the building across the street, then briefly brushed the edge of my window before cutting off again. I stayed completely still after that. I didn't hear voices. I didn't hear footsteps. Just silence. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down and sleep, telling myself it was probably someone checking their phone in the parking lot or messing around with a flashlight. The next morning, everything looked normal. No signs of damage. No reason to think anything was wrong. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. After that night, I started paying closer attention to things I normally would have ignored. Not in a paranoid way. At least, not consciously. More like I became aware of how often I looked out my windows without really realizing I was doing it. Nothing happened for a while, and I started to relax again. Weeks passed. Then, a couple of months. I convinced myself the light had been a one-off. Maybe someone looking for a dropped item or checking a license plate. There was no reason to assume anything else. Then one evening, while I was walking back from the grocery store, I noticed a car idling in the parking lot of my building. It wasn't parked in a spot. It was just stopped near the entrance, engine running, headlights on. I slowed my pace slightly, pretending to check my phone, mostly because I didn't want to walk straight past it. As I got closer, the headlights turned off. The engine stayed running. I remember feeling oddly exposed, like the dark suddenly worked against me instead of for me. I walked into the building without looking directly at the car again, telling myself that if someone really were watching me, They wouldn't make it that obvious. Later that night, I mentioned it casually to a friend over text. I didn't frame it as anything serious, just something strange I'd noticed. He joked that I was probably becoming that guy, the one who assumes every weird coincidence means something. I laughed and agreed with him. That was easier than admitting the situation had unsettled me more than I wanted to acknowledge. A few days later, I came home to find a package sitting outside my door. That part wasn't unusual. What was strange was that I hadn't ordered anything. The box was plain. No branding, no return address. My name and apartment number were written neatly on the label, spelled correctly. Inside was nothing but a folded piece of brown paper. No message, no explanation. I stood there for a while trying to decide whether I was missing something obvious. Eventually, I threw it away and washed my hands, annoyed at myself for feeling uneasy over what was probably a delivery mistake. That night, I didn't sleep well. A week after that, my downstairs neighbor knocked on my door. We didn't talk much, but she seemed nervous. She asked if I'd noticed anyone hanging around the building late at night. I felt my stomach tighten immediately, but I didn't let it show. I asked her what she meant. She said she'd seen the same car parked across the street several nights in a row. Same make, same color, always leaving before morning. She wasn't accusing anyone or making a big deal out of it, just asking if I'd noticed anything similar. I told her no. I don't know why I lied. Maybe because saying yes would have made it feel real. After she left, I sat on my couch for a long time, replaying everything in my head. The light outside my window, the car in the parking lot, the package. None of it was definitive on its own, but together, they didn't sit right. A few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was an unknown number. I didn't answer it. I watched it stop ringing, then start again. I let it go to voicemail. When I checked the voicemail the next morning, there was nothing recorded. Just several seconds of silence. I tried calling the number back later that day, but it went straight to a disconnected message. At that point, I started questioning my own reactions. I wondered if stress was getting to me, if I was subconsciously linking unrelated events because I needed them to make sense. That explanation still felt more comfortable than the alternative. But even as I told myself that, I started closing my blinds earlier at night, and I started checking my locks more than once. By that point, I had stopped trying to convince myself nothing was happening. I wasn't panicking, but I was no longer comfortable dismissing things outright. The problem was that there still wasn't anything concrete enough to act on. No threats, no direct contact, just a growing sense that I was being observed in ways that didn't leave obvious traces. What really changed things happened during the middle of the day. I had taken a half day off work and was walking back to my apartment around early afternoon. As I turned the corner onto my street, I noticed someone standing near the entrance to my building. He wasn't leaning against the wall or checking his phone like people usually do when they're waiting. He was just standing there, hands at his sides, looking up toward the building. I slowed down instinctively. He didn't look threatening. Mid-30s maybe. Average build. Dressed normally. The kind of person you wouldn't remember if you passed them on the street. As I got closer, he glanced at me briefly, then looked back up at the building like he'd lost interest. I walked past him and went inside without incident. Later that evening, I realized something that made my stomach drop. When I'd walked past him, he hadn't been looking at the building in general. He'd been looking at my window. The angle made sense now that I thought about it. From where he was standing, you could see straight into my apartment if the blinds were open. I hadn't closed them that day. That night, I didn't turn the lights on right away. I stood in my kitchen, barely lit by the glow from outside, and watched my reflection in the dark glass. Nothing moved. No lights, no shapes. Still, I waited longer than necessary before going about my evening. A few days later, I ran into a coworker at a coffee shop near my office. We chatted briefly, nothing important, until he casually mentioned seeing me the other night near my building. That caught me off guard. I asked him what he meant. He said he'd been driving through my neighborhood late and thought he saw me standing near the entrance of my apartment complex. He even joked that I must have a twin because I'd looked right at him and then walked away without saying anything. I told him it couldn't have been me. He laughed and shrugged it off. But I couldn't. I hadn't been outside that night. I was sure of it. I asked him to describe what I'd been wearing. He did, and it matched something I owned almost exactly. After that conversation, I started keeping track of things. Not obsessively, but deliberately. Times, locations, what I noticed, and when. Patterns became harder to ignore once I stopped pretending they weren't there. Someone was present around my building even when I wasn't. Someone knew what I looked like well enough to be mistaken for me, and whoever it was seemed comfortable being seen, as long as it didn't lead to direct confrontation. The idea that scared me most wasn't that someone wanted to hurt me. It was that they didn't seem to be in a hurry. Whatever this was, it felt ongoing, patient, like I was just one part of a routine they'd already rehearsed. That was the first time I considered telling someone in my family about it, and that was also the first time I wondered how long this had really been happening. I ended up calling my older sister that night, not because I wanted advice, but because she knows me well enough to tell when I'm exaggerating. I figured if she reacted calmly, I could convince myself I was still overthinking things. I didn't lead with the stranger outside my building or the phone calls. I started by asking her if she remembered anything strange happening around our house when we were younger. Cars on the street, people hanging around, anything that stood out. There was a long pause on the line before she answered. She asked me why I was bringing that up. That was the moment my chest tightened. I told her about the car I'd seen years ago, back when I still lived at home, the one that drove past slowly and parked in front of the house. I hadn't even finished describing it before she interrupted me and said she remembered it too. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who noticed. She told me there had been multiple nights where our parents would quietly check the windows before going to bed. Not in a dramatic way, just a quick look outside, like they were confirming something. She said she'd once asked our mom about it and was told not to worry, that it was just someone lost. At the time, she accepted that answer. Now, she wasn't so sure. I asked her if she remembered anything else. She hesitated again before telling me something I'd never heard before. A few years after the car incident, she'd noticed someone walking past the house repeatedly while she was home alone one afternoon, back and forth. Same person, same pace, never stopping. When she told our dad, he brushed it off and said she was probably noticing a jogger. But she'd never seen the person again. I hung up the phone feeling worse than before, not panicked. Just validated in a way I didn't want to be. These weren't isolated incidents anymore. They were shared experiences, separated by years but tied together by the same quiet pattern. That night, I dug out an old external hard drive I used to store photos from my teenage years. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but something told me to check anyway. I scrolled through folders, half expecting to find nothing, until I came across a video I didn't remember recording. It was taken from my bedroom window at my parents' house, just a few seconds long, shaky, dark. The timestamp put it around the same year as the flashlight incident I'd experienced as a teenager. In the video, you can barely make anything out at first. Then a car slowly enters the frame. It moves the same way I remembered, unnaturally slow. It pauses for a moment, then continues out of view. I must have recorded it without fully understanding why at the time. Watching it now made my skin crawl in a way it never had before. Not because of what was in the video, but because of why I'd felt the need to capture it. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided I needed answers, even if they weren't the ones I wanted. I called my parents and asked them directly if there had ever been a reason they were concerned about our house when we were growing up. I expected denial. What I got instead was silence. My dad eventually said they didn't want to scare us. That was all he offered. He changed the subject after that, and I didn't push. But it was enough. It confirmed what I'd been trying not to believe. This didn't start with me. And whatever it was, my parents had known something was wrong long before I ever noticed. That realization was the first time I felt actual fear. Not because I knew what was happening, but because I didn't. After that conversation with my parents, I tried to go back to my normal routine. Not because I felt safe, but because I didn't know what else to do. There was still nothing actionable. No crime. No confrontation. Just a growing awareness that whatever this was, it wasn't limited to one place or one phase of my life. The next incident happened somewhere I'd always considered neutral, public, busy, the kind of place where nothing personal is supposed to follow you. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was at a grocery store a few miles from my apartment. I go there often enough that I recognize some of the employees, but not enough to know anyone personally. I was halfway through my list when I noticed a man standing at the end of the aisle, pretending to look at the shelves. What caught my attention wasn't his presence. It was the way he stayed there. Every time I moved, he shifted too, always just far enough away that it didn't look intentional. If I reached for something, he'd turn his head slightly. If I stepped forward, he'd move his cart. It was subtle enough that I could have ignored it if I wanted to, but I didn't. I tested it. I doubled back down an aisle for no reason, then stopped abruptly. A few seconds later, he appeared at the end again, pretending to read labels. When I looked directly at him this time, he didn't look away immediately. He held eye contact just long enough to let me know it wasn't an accident. I left the store without finishing my shopping. In the parking lot, I waited inside my car for a few minutes before pulling out. I told myself I was being cautious, not paranoid. When I finally did leave, I noticed a vehicle pull out a few spaces behind me. Same direction, same turns. I drove an unnecessarily long route home just to be sure. The car followed me the entire way. I didn't speed up. I didn't slow down. I didn't want to do anything that would force the situation to escalate. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, the car continued past the entrance without turning in. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. Later that night, I found something taped to my door. Just a small slip of paper, folded once. No writing, no symbol, nothing that could be interpreted as a message. It was the kind of thing you might miss if you weren't looking for it. I stood there holding it, realizing that whoever had left it knew exactly where I lived. Not just the building. My unit. That was the moment avoidance stopped being an option. I called my sister again and told her everything I hadn't said the first time. The car. The grocery store. The paper on my door. She didn't interrupt me. When I finished, she said something that stuck with me. She said, "It sounds like they're checking to see if you notice." I asked her what she meant. She said, "They're not hiding. They're watching how you react." That idea settled in my mind in a way I couldn't shake. It explained the restraint, the lack of urgency, the absence of threats. This wasn't about taking something. It was about presence. That night, I sat in the dark with the lights off, watching my window reflected back at me. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Long enough to realize how exposed I'd been my entire life without knowing it. And long enough to understand that whatever this was, it wasn't finished. After that night, I stopped going out unless I had to. I still went to work, still ran errands, but I became more deliberate about it. Different routes, different times. I avoided patterns as much as I could, even though part of me knew it was probably too late for that to matter. For a while, nothing happened. No cars, no notes, no strangers lingering where they shouldn't be. That silence almost convinced me I'd reached some kind of breaking point where my mind had started filling in gaps that weren't really there. I even caught myself feeling embarrassed for how far I'd let the situation get in my head. Then I saw him again. It was early evening, just after sunset, and I was walking out of my office building toward the parking garage across the street. The sidewalk was busy, people moving in both directions, traffic picking up for rush hour. I noticed him standing near the corner, leaning against a light pole like he was waiting for someone. At first, I didn't recognize him. There was nothing distinct about the way he dressed or carried himself. But when he turned his head and our eyes met, something clicked immediately. The recognition wasn't visual at first. It was instinctive, the kind you feel before your brain catches up. I had seen him before. Not recently, not clearly, but enough times, in enough different places, that my body reacted before my thoughts did. My chest tightened, and my pace slowed without me meaning to. He didn't stare. He didn't smile. He just watched me pass, calm and unbothered, like this was exactly what he'd expected to happen. I kept walking, forcing myself not to turn around, but I could feel his attention on me the entire time. When I reached the garage and glanced back. He was gone. That night, I went through old photos again, not looking for him specifically, just scanning backgrounds, reflections, windows, places where people don't usually look first. I didn't find anything definitive, but I found enough moments where someone could have been there without me noticing at the time. The next day, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line, no message, just a single attachment. I didn't open it right away. I stared at the screen, aware of how ridiculous the situation sounded even in my own head. Eventually, I saved the file and opened it. It was a photo. Not of me, directly. It was a photo of the front of my parents' old house, taken from across the street. The angle matched the window my dad used to work at night. The timestamp was from over 10 years ago. I sat there staring at it, feeling something shift permanently. This wasn't random. It wasn't recent. And it wasn't limited to me. The message was clear without a single word being written. They had been there from the beginning, and they wanted me to know that I knew. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't delete it either. I left it exactly where it was, unopened again, after that first look, like pretending it didn't exist might somehow limit its power. I knew better than to believe that, but I wasn't ready to do anything else. Instead, I went to the police. I didn't expect much, and I made sure not to present it like some conspiracy or long-term stalking case. I focused on what was recent. The following: the photo, the unknown emails. I left out most of the childhood details because I knew how it would sound. Even so, the officer listening to me had the same expression I'd seen before on other people's faces: polite, attentive, non-committal. They took a report. They asked if the person had threatened me directly. They asked if I'd been approached or harmed. When I said no to both, I could feel the conversation quietly winding down. They told me to stay alert, to document anything else that happened, and to call if someone tried to make contact. I left knowing nothing would come of it. 2 days later, the email was gone. Not deleted, not moved, gone. I checked every folder: spam, trash, archived, nothing. I even checked login history, thinking maybe someone had accessed my account. There was nothing unusual. No unfamiliar IPs. No warnings. It was as if the message had never existed at all. That same night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I didn't answer. I watched it ring until it stopped. A few seconds later, it rang again. I silenced it and sat there, staring at the screen. When it finally stopped for good, I waited for the voicemail notification. There wasn't one. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Whoever this was didn't want interaction. They wanted awareness. They wanted me to recognize the pattern without ever being able to prove it. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I noticed something new. A car parked across the street from my building. Not unusual on its own. What made me stop was the position. It was parked directly in line with my apartment windows. The engine wasn't running. No one was visible inside. As I stood there, debating whether to take a picture, the car's headlights flashed once, just a quick blink. Then, nothing. I didn't take the picture. I went to work and tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about how deliberate everything had become. The timing, the restraint, the way every attempt to involve someone else seemed to be anticipated. That night, I closed every blind and turned off every light before sitting down. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Part of me hoped nothing would happen. Another part of me knew that wouldn't last. Because for the first time since this started, it felt like I'd been acknowledged, and whatever was watching me knew I'd tried to fight back. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No break-ins, no confrontations, no messages spelling things out. If that's what you're expecting, this probably isn't going to be satisfying. What changed instead was my sense of normalcy. The car across the street wasn't there the next morning, and I didn't see it again after that. The phone didn't ring. No new emails came through. On the surface, everything went back to the way it had been before. That almost made it worse. It felt less like an ending and more like a pause. I moved a few months later. Not because I thought it would fix anything, but because staying in that apartment felt like willingly standing in a place where I already knew I was exposed. I didn't tell many people why I was leaving. I framed it as a fresh start, which wasn't entirely a lie. The strange thing is that moving did help, at least in practical ways. New surroundings, new routines, new windows. I stopped checking behind me as often. I slept better. For a while, I even caught myself believing that whatever had been happening was tied to that specific place and had finally been left behind. Then I noticed the small things again. A car idling longer than necessary, a person standing still when everyone else was moving. The feeling of being observed without any clear source. I can't point to any one moment and say, that's when it started again. It's more like it never fully stopped. I don't talk about it much anymore. Not because I'm afraid people won't believe me, but because I've learned there's a difference between being seen and being understood. Most people want a clear explanation, a motive, a reason. I don't have any of those. What I do have is a pattern that stretches back further than I ever realized. A series of moments that made sense only when viewed together, and the knowledge that acknowledging it didn't make it go away. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that not every threat announces itself. Some things don't rush. They don't need to. They wait to be noticed, and once they are, they adapt. I still go to work. I still live my life. On the outside, nothing about me has changed, but I'm careful now in ways I never used to be. I pay attention to reflections, to timing, to who's where and when. And sometimes, late at night, I think about how long someone would have to watch before they felt entitled to my attention. That's the part I can't shake, because I'm not afraid of being followed. I'm afraid of being familiar.